All right, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our, our August webinar about interview skills. My name is Rebecca Smetana. I'm one of the admissions officers here at the school, and I'm glad to see such a big group of students who are interested in such an important topic. So we hope this information is really helpful as you look ahead to maybe your own interview at optometry school. And we encourage you to listen in, but of course ask your questions along the way. So we'll be monitoring your questions in the chat box on the webinar system as always. And without any further ado, I want to go ahead and introduce Mr. Joe Hauser, who is our Vice President for Student Services here at SCO. He's going to lead the conversation today.
Good afternoon, everybody. I always like to start off with why we interview the way that we do, and before getting into the meat and potatoes of the content. If you like open file, having your grades scrutinized in front of a panel of 5 people with white lab coats, you can blame me for not. I hated that back when I was a student. I always thought that a format like that really was intimidating and put the student on edge. And our objective of our interview at SCO, first of all, it's a blind interview, meaning the interviewer knows nothing about your file. So you're not defending a C that you made in your freshman year or in organic chemistry, or if you had that one term that just wasn't as good, or you had one section of the OAT that might not be as strong as the others. Those will be evaluated, but it's not a part of the formal interview, and intentionally so. So our interview format's much more, at least I think, conversational and laid back. At least that's the intent, so that the interviewer, who is a faculty member who sees patients in our clinic, the eye center, and our #1 objective on our end is to try to have the interviewer evaluate the communication skills, and can they see the interviewing applicant in our clinic seeing patients down the road. So it's a lot more conversational and a lot more laid back. So I just want to preface the kind of the overview before we get into some of the more specifics of our interview. So the slide that you see, the big 3, I hate to categorize too much, but really also, what are we trying to extract from the interview? What is your experience, when we really mean that is your optometric experience, as far as, have you done your homework? What kind of shadowing or work experience? Have you made a smart decision on optometry? And we'll go into more details on these, but these are just an outline. Do you have the discipline to succeed, especially with academic discipline, time management? What kind of life experiences and academic experiences have you had, which is a predictor for success in optometry school? And then, as far as your understanding of the current state of not only optometry, but healthcare in general, we're not asking you necessarily such specifics, but just optometry's role in overall healthcare, and maybe as you evaluated optometry versus other health field options, medicine, dentistry, pharmacy, etc. What kind of understanding do you have of optometry's role going into it? All right, so things to be prepared to discuss. Now, also, one of the things I want to stress, each interviewer will have his or her own style, and it's a random draw. We don't match. Oh, let's get this one applicant who has this experience with another interviewer. It is a random draw from that standpoint. So each interviewer will have his or her own questions, but we can't 100% predict that you, John Smith, or you, Jane Smith, are going to have these very set questions, because the interviewer does have their own style. But these are the basic things, or the most common things that each interviewer. So be prepared to discuss your shadowing, your work experience in the field. It always looks better the more diversity that you have. Remember, you're interviewing with an optometrist. So there's nothing more flattering to an optometrist than when an applicant has spent a due amount of time shadowing or working in the field, versus, oh, I've only spent 10 hours in one practice and that's the extent of what I know. So the more you can talk about, the better impression that you have. But then when you start talking about the shadowing work experiences and comparing and contrasting, be prepared to explain to your interviewer the differences in the practices that you've seen. It gives the interviewer the idea that you picked up on those differences and understand that one of the beauties of optometry is it can be practiced in such different ways, and we want to make sure that you're exposed to that before coming to optometry school. Understanding the scope of the profession, optometry is a legislative profession, as you may know already, and each state has its own set of laws, and that's been a very progressive, like for example, the state of Arkansas, just next door to Tennessee, just passed certain laser and surgical procedures laws just within the last 2 months. So it's a very evolving process, and we want to make sure that you're aware that even if your state may have a certain set of laws today, a year from now, 2 years from now, might be totally different, and it's a very dynamic and fluid field right now. And then also specialty interest areas. Again, optometry, unlike medicine where you go to medical school, get your 4-year degree, then you have to declare which residency. So if you want to do dermatology or pediatrics or whatnot, you then specify and start focusing your training in that area. With optometry, your license allows you to see patients and practice in a very broad spectrum. Having said that, though, some doctors will self-select or elect to narrow that focus and, for example, only see children or vision therapy patients, or primarily only see geriatric or low vision patients, maybe specializing in contact lens, ocular disease, brain and head injury, and trauma. Again, we want to make sure that you're exposed to as many of these areas before you start optometry school so that you have a very good understanding of the full breadth of the field. Regarding discipline, this is obviously very subjective. There's not a color by numbers formula that we can give you with this. But we want to, an interviewer might ask you questions about how you balance life and school, or what was a challenging, like a question I always like to ask, what was your biggest hurdle to clear in college and how did you overcome it? It could be academic, it could have been personal, it could have been emotional, or it could be a number of things. So we do want to have you talk a little bit about how you deal with stress or high pressure, or how you've overcome to succeed things in the past. Kind of the same thing with the next bullet about adaptability. Optometry school will have some significant challenges as far as time demands and having to study more than you did in undergrad, and maybe even differently and more effectively. So what worked in undergrad might not work in optometry school. So if an undergrad staying up and pulling an all-nighter at a coffee shop and drinking 14 gallons of coffee was what worked to get you a good grade in undergrad, might not be the recipe, probably would not be the recipe for success in optometry school. So you might have to kind of change and adapt your study habits. And then ability and willing to sacrifice isn't, I guess it goes back to changing. Again, what worked in undergrad, as you enter a doctoral program and you're going from taking 16 hours a term to 23, 24 hours a term, and all of them are heavy lab intensive courses, so you don't have any easy electives thrown in there. You certainly might have to adjust a little bit, and some of that willing and sacrifices that, well, I know in optometry school I might not be able to go out as much, I might not be able to hang out with my friends as much, I might not be able to call home or time with my girlfriend or significant other as much as it used to be, but you're being aware of it up front is important. Have you done your homework? And this is not like we're sending you a test before the interview. It's have you researched and done your homework about optometry and SEO? Understanding the commitment involved, the time demands, again, as we mentioned earlier. Optometry's role in healthcare. Again, if a student on an interview, oh yes, I plan to work 10 hours a week and make $2 million a year. Well, that might be an unrealistic goal or expectation. So we want to make sure that, again, if you spent more time with different optometrists, you'd have a better idea of things like income capacity, home life, and work balance, as far as what do those optometrists, how many hours do they work? Are they able to still coach their children's soccer team on in the evenings or on the weekends, or are still able to do hobbies and travel and other things outside of work? With that is a very healthy thing for you to engage any optometrist with beforehand, because we certainly want to discuss that on the interview. And then again, working knowledge of healthcare systems as far as optometry's role in healthcare delivery is very important. So we're going to talk a little bit about the overall SEO admissions process and then how the interview plays into that. It's a huge, huge part. If it weren't huge, why would we do it? So step one, you'll submit your Optomcast and SEO supplemental application with a rolling admission with SEO. We can't interview you or invite you to an interview until we have your completed application and supporting documents, your transcripts, your letters of recommendation, your essays, etc. So step two is once we receive your applications, it will be evaluated by the admissions team. Mike Robertson, our admissions director in particular, is incredible about feedback. So if he gets your application and shares with you, hey, John, Sally, everything looks great about your file, but there's one thing that's either missing or needed before we can move forward, definitely attend to that. He's not bringing this to your attention for his own health. He's doing this to make sure that you're aware that there's one piece missing or there's one thing that you might want to do before moving forward. And of course, that goes into the initial review of the application. Mr. Robertson may also get back to you and say, hey, your OAT score was okay, but maybe not stellar. And you might get called for an interview later, but if you want an earlier interview, you might want to reconsider retaking the OAT, or letting you know that your fall grades will be an important factor in the review depending upon the strength of your file. Before going any further, with rolling admission, I do want to stress that all else being equal, a student with a 3.8, 380 on the OAT might get called for an interview before someone with a 3.1, 310. But it doesn't mean that 3.1, 310 isn't of interest to us or isn't important to us. We are one of the more difficult schools to get into, just based upon our GPA OAT. But that I don't want for you or anyone to misinterpret that as, oh, well, I guess SEO doesn't want me as much because another school has invited me for an interview. I kind of give the example, if you're applying to colleges out of high school and you're applying to a community college in Harvard, just because you get accepted to community college before Harvard doesn't mean that Harvard isn't any less interested. It just means that the process may take a little bit longer due to the rolling admission. So the earlier you get stuff in and the earlier you submit competitive credentials helps out with that. And that's the initial review of the application, or step three. Step four, what we're talking about today, a selection and invitation for an interview. Mike Robertson, our admissions director, with input from others on the admissions team, will contact you, usually by email. If sometimes it could be a day after your application gets in, or it might be a few weeks or a month or so afterward, depending upon what's missing, and again, the overall competitiveness of your file. Also, speaking for Mike, it's never an inconvenience to reach out to Mr. Robertson. If you have submitted your application and maybe it's been 2 weeks and you haven't heard whether you're invited for an interview, and you reach out to him to ask, is there anything else I can do to improve my chances or enhance my file? Mr. Robertson is great about providing that very specific input, or where you stand in the process, because you might be, oh, you're on my next batch ready to go out for an invitation very soon. So the day of the interview, we typically interview on Fridays of the year. Early in the cycle, we do some Monday interviews too. When you're invited, you'll usually have 3, 4, 5 interview dates from which to choose, because we realize that not every date would be open for you as far as availability. So we want to give you ample opportunities. I would try to schedule your interview on the earlier side, I wouldn't wait 4 months to schedule it, because with rolling admission again, the earlier that you get in, the earlier that we meet as an admissions committee. And if you're from a contract state, which is, or a regional state for a lower tuition, those go on a rolling admission, and as does scholarships. So if you would otherwise be qualified for a scholarship or a contract seat, if you wait until like January to come for an interview versus September, those seats or those scholarships might be gone by then with a rolling admission. So you want to set the interview up on the early side if you can. And then the day or after the interview day, the admissions committee meets weekly, usually in the middle part of the week, to evaluate those that have interviewed. So we'll be meeting just a few days after your interview, and we'll get back with you by phone usually to let you know. So it's usually a fairly quick turnaround from your interview date to when someone from the admissions team will contact you with an evaluation and decision. So the cycle, as far as just kind of once invited for an interview to admissions, again, once you submit your Optomcast application, your SEO supplemental application, and all the supporting documentation, Mr. Robertson will be evaluating and prospectively could invite you for an interview again by email with instructions on how to set it up. As I referenced earlier, it's a blind and one-on-one interview format. So it's usually much more conversational than maybe what you would have fixed with, and I forgot to say this, other schools have different ways of interviewing. And I'm not saying that a panel interview is bad or an open file is bad or wrong. We just feel a closed file and one-on-one fits for us. Since we're such a clinically driven school, we want to make sure that we're assessing that assessment's very important to us, and we just feel a closed file or blind interview is best for us to get that kind of assessment. Also, the day of the interview, since the interview is closed file, you'll have a counseling session with one of the admissions officers, which is open file, going over, making sure all your prerequisites are completed, or you have a plan for completing, a schedule to complete them. What's lacking in your file? What are your strengths? Or maybe if there's that one aspect of your file that might be a bit weaker than the others, the counselor may talk a little bit about that to try to get more information from you that we can present to the committee. And it's really your opportunity to ask questions too, like, well, when can I expect to hear something? Where do I stand with contract seats or scholarships, or et cetera, et cetera. You also have a financial aid and housing session, giving you information on that. You also get a full campus tour on the interview day given by one or two of our students, and a great opportunity for you to ask questions of our students, not just our faculty and staff. And then, as I mentioned earlier, just days after the interview, the admissions committee will meet, review your file, and then get back with you within a very, very short timetable. So before the interview, things to think about and be prepared for. This may go without saying, but you'd be amazed how sometimes it happens. Check the itinerary and flight so that if your interview is at 9 o'clock and your flight arrives in Memphis at 8:58, that might be a logistical problem as far as getting here on time. Give yourself some cushion, not just in case if a flight runs a little bit late or anything like that, but I think most would agree that once you arrive, whether it be by car or by flight, that you want a little time to kind of settle down and think about your day. So you just don't want to be rushed. And the same goes as you're leaving. We will tell you how long your interview will last, or I should say the interview day will last. So again, if your interview day is scheduled in at 1 o'clock, scheduling a 1:30 flight might not be the most judicious thought as far as rushing your travel. It's also, I think it's important to spend some time in Memphis. If you're not from the area, if you've never been to Memphis before, I think a lot of our students find living in Memphis is one of the huge pros and assets. The cost of living is very inexpensive relative to our sister cities with optometry schools. There's just a lot to do in Memphis, especially right around campus. So maybe spending a day exploring Memphis a little bit. Again, our office does a great job of sending you information in advance of what's going on in the city, either the day before or the day after your interview. So if you wanted to spend a little time, it would give you some ideas of what your options might be and how you could do that. Regarding bringing guests on the interview day, there's two things I want to mention. It's about 50-50. About half our students will bring someone and about half will not. My threshold is, and I'll start with parents. You know your parents better than anyone. I'm a parent, and my kids would probably rather have their toenails pulled out than me coming with them on an interview. So what I would recommend is, if having your parents around will make you more anxious or nervous, keep them at home. On the contrary, if you feel it would be very relieving, or yes, I do want my mom or dad or both to be with me to see the campus and talk about it later, then that should be the litmus test as far as whether or not you would want them to come. I would normally say try to limit the guests to 2. If you're saying, oh, I'm bringing 8 people with me on my interview, it could be interpreted as a little odd and peculiar. So I would say if you were bringing guests, maybe limiting it to 2 would be a good threshold to consider. But if you don't bring anyone, it's perfectly fine. I think you should do whatever makes you feel most comfortable. Attire for the interview. Gentlemen, no one will ever be offended if you wear a coat and tie. So I'm a big believer, you only have one chance of making a first impression. So if you show up with blue jeans, a sweatshirt, and your hair sort of disheveled, does that mean you're a bad person? No, but it might give the impression that you're maybe a little apathetic or indifferent about the interview day, and that certainly is not the impression, again, that you want to make. Ladies, an appropriate dress or business attire, a blouse and slacks are perfectly appropriate, and we get a pretty good variety, or I should say that's a very commonplace. I would say, and again, I can only speak from what our female applicants have said, you'll be doing a lot of walking, so even if those 5-inch heels look very good on a certain outfit, you might want to dress a little more conservatively on the attire so that your walking that day is a pleasant experience and not a negative one. And then questions to ask. I'm a big believer, when I'm talking with an applicant or interviewing, I'm sometimes more impressed by the questions that you have of me than your responses to my questions. So it's perfectly appropriate to ask questions of your interviewer, the admissions staff, but also students when you're on tour and meeting current students. Why did you choose SEO? Or what was your biggest challenge? Where do you live? What's there to do in Memphis? Have you enjoyed the experience living in Memphis? These are all perfectly appropriate and encouraged questions to ask. So being prepared. Now, as I mentioned earlier, each interviewer will have his or her own style. So there's not a cookie cutter formula. But again, things that you want to be prepared for, or questions that are oftenly asked. Tell me about yourself. And we really want to know about you, not what grade you made in organic chemistry. That's not you. That's an activity. So if the interviewer asks about you, they really want to know more about you as a person, not necessarily a student. Why you want to be an optometrist. And these are the kind of questions that I wish I could explain better, but we can tell when an answer is from the heart and organic versus, oh, I was told I better answer this question this way, and it comes across contrived. So when answering all questions, but in particular these kind of questions from the interviewer, even if you think your answer might put you initially in negative light, be honest. Talk about you as a person and explain about you. What if optometry school doesn't work? This could be kind of perceived as a tricky question here, and it's not meant to be. If optometry school doesn't work out, what would you do, or career alternatives. It's not meant to be a trick question like, well, if you don't get in this year, what are you going to do? Well, I guess I'll apply for some other. What, you want to apply for optometry school again? What's wrong with you? No, it's not meant to be that. But we do want to, it's healthy, I think, for you to think about, well, if I don't get in to either optometry school or my school of first choice, what is my plan B? It shows preparation, and it shows diligence in having a plan. Is there anything else that you'd like to share? Sometimes the questions the interviewer will ask will not allow you, or initially allow you to talk about some things that you really want that interviewer to know about you. So, like, my all-time favorite is we had an Olympian interview. So Josh was very humble, and it didn't come out. And I just asked, well, what else have you done? He went to BYU undergrad. Well, what else did you do when you were at BYU? And remember, I didn't have his file in front of him, so I didn't know. And his response, well, I sort of qualified for the Olympics, which I thought was incredibly humble when he said, I sort of qualified for the Olympics. So if there's some things that are important about you, or neat things that you haven't had a chance to talk about, at the end of the interview, usually the interviewer will give you that opportunity. And then again, asking questions of the interviewer. Dr. Jones, what do you do at SCO? Are you an SCO grad? Or what do you like best about SCO or working with students? These are all wonderful questions and potential questions to ask. So during the interview, remember, the interviewer knows nothing about you. So making their job easier to fill out the evaluation is in your benefit. When they ask you questions, don't say yes or no. Elaborate. Tell them and answer the question directly. Sometimes it can be a little frustrating when an interviewer asks, well, tell me about what are you looking for in optometry school, and the applicant kind of goes off on a tangent and talks about other things not related to that. That answer the question directly shows good listening skills and ability to think on your feet. Be energetic, have fun in an appropriate way. There's a fine balance of being yourself and having an enjoyable experience and being yourself, but also the protocol. I wouldn't call the interviewer by their first name, even if they introduce themselves as, hi, I'm Dan Fuller. It's Dr. Fuller. And no one will ever be offended if you call the faculty member by their more formal name versus, hey, Dan, how's it going? That can be interpreted as a little disrespectful, even if it's not meant to be. Also, when following up, if you want to send an email thanking them, be careful that it's not too casual on the email. It doesn't have to be so formal that it's rigid, but again, you don't want to come across as too casual or too lax in communication, both in the interview time as well as a follow-up afterwards. Again, do you give the interviewer something to work with? Answering the questions and answering the questions fully and completely allows the interviewer to there's a reason why they're asking the questions that they're asking. So the more complete and thorough that you can answer them is great. And then what's unique about you? Why should we choose you over maybe someone else who's equally qualified? So what do you bring to the table, whether it be life experiences, background, diversity, conviction for the field? All these are wonderful things that allow us to have 136 applicants and entering students that make a unique melting pot, which is our goal and objective. But what do you bring to the table that is unique and makes you stand out a little bit is also good to express during the interview. And then next steps after the interview. Should you follow up with the interviewer? By all means, sending them an email, thanking them, or a thank you note or a thank you card. Again, I would refrain from being too casual. I wouldn't. If you're writing a thank you card, I wouldn't start off with, "Hey, bud," or you want to show deference. And but at the same time, it doesn't have to be haughty or anything overkill, but definitely showing the due respect, especially to the interviewer, is always well received. How to accept, delay, or decline an admissions offer. Obviously, you're going to be applying to other schools, and you might be hearing from other schools. So if you're scheduled for an interview and it's 2 weeks out, and you've heard from another school, and you've definitely said, I'm going to that other school as my first school of choice, it's close to home or whatever it may be, let us know, because that interview spot could be filled or used by another student. It's a little, actually, to let you know this in advance, if you no-show for an interview, not just here at SCO, but any school, we're supposed to call that into this kind of like repository of all the schools, because most would consider that unprofessional if you had an interview and just simply no-showed. Now, granted, if the night before you have 104 fever and you can't make it or something like that, we totally understand, and just let us know. But going back to admissions offers, we want you to have time to think about it. In fact, this time of year, when we accept a student, we give you 8 weeks to decide if you wish to submit a tuition deposit, which is on the larger or longer scale compared to other schools. So that gives you time to go to other interviews and think about it. We don't want to rush the decision. Different schools have different policies. Some schools, it's 2 weeks with $1,000 non-refundable deposit. So you want to kind of know in advance, okay, if I go to this interview, how much time will I have in making a decision, and what kind of financial commitment that is. It's always good to know in advance, because if you've been invited for an interview, that's usually a pretty good step toward that school being very interested in you. And then as far as declining, sometimes it's just a simple email saying, dear SEO, thank you for the offer or what, but I've decided to choose somewhere else. That's perfectly appropriate, perfectly fine. How to follow up on suggestions. This is big, because on the and usually it deals with shadowing and direct experience. Let's say you've been in one office and have gotten a great experience, but maybe that doctor's office is a little limited, dare I say, maybe a little old-fashioned or not as progressive with technology or expansion of scope, and we feel it's in your best interest to get some additional shadowing. It's not a punishment. If you've got a 40, 50-year career ahead of you, we want to make sure that you're exposed to all aspects of the field. So if we share with you that, hey, John, everything looks great about your file, but here's the one thing that we need you to follow up on, and we'd like to get like 10, 15 hours of additional shadowing, maybe in a group practice or private practice, or maybe in a practice where there's an optometrist and ophthalmologist, we'd be very specific. The faster that you can do that and then share documentation or input about that will greatly help your admissions process. So we're not making it, if and when we do that, we're not doing that to make you jump through a hoop. We're doing this because we feel it's in your long-term best interest to be exposed to that.
All right, so that brings us to the end of the presentation. I want to thank Mr. Hauser for all of the wisdom and information shared, and ask you all out there for a couple of things. So first and foremost, if you have any questions about the presentation today, please type them into the question and answer box. Mr. Hauser is a wealth of information. He participates in the interview days as a counselor and occasionally as an interviewer, and he presents during the housing portion of the lunch. So he's very, very involved in the interview process and has been for a number of years. So if you have any sorts of questions about the interview day, or what to prepare, or what you need to do to make a good impression, please ask away. Of course, you can contact us after the fact at any point in time with your questions. We have our contact information out here for you to see. We'll record, or we have recorded this session, and we'll share it on our YouTube page. And I'm getting ready to announce the fall webinar series. So the other thing I want to ask is if anyone has requests for webinar topics. I try to develop a webinar series that covers what I believe to be the most important things for prospective students, but not being a prospective student myself, I want to make sure I'm not missing anything that you all would find really valuable. So if you have a unique idea for something you want to hear us talk about, I would love to hear it. So you can email me or chat or whatever would be easiest for you and let me know what you want us to talk about during these webinars. So I see a couple questions popping up. I'm going to get to those. So this question is, would SEO provide a student host for students coming to Memphis for interviews?
Informally, yes. We do not have like formal housing. We do not have on-campus housing like dormitories. Most of our students live within 5 to 10 minutes, but we many times will connect. Like, for example, especially if you're coming from a long distance, like if you're coming to us from Arizona or New Jersey or Michigan, and you're thinking, boy, wouldn't it be great to talk to another student from my home state or alma mater? The nice thing of having 537 students in the program and represented by more states than any other school of optometry, it's usually pretty easy for us to match you with a current student, as I like to say, who's walked a mile in your shoes. So from a standpoint of putting you in contact with a student beforehand, absolutely. When I say host, if a student were to say and volunteer that, hey, if you want to, you can stay in my apartment, we don't discourage that or say you can't do that, but I wouldn't want to put a student on a spot of, well, I've already got 2 roommates in my apartment, so bringing somebody else might be a little more crowded. So depending on what the definition of host means, but we definitely can connect you with students in advance and let you hear from them. And you'll be meeting a ton of students on the interview day. And many times, because we post where everyone's from, so if you're from the University of Florida or the University of Michigan, and students will come up and see, oh, I see we got an interview applicant today that's from my alma mater. They'll usually pop up and say hello and everything. So from that standpoint, you would definitely be interacting with a lot of our students.
The next question is, if an applicant doesn't get accepted for an interview, will he or she be notified through email?
Yes, but it's also ongoing. So if you were to apply, like right now, well, we're in the early stages of receiving applications, but we've received almost 200 applications to date. So just because a student has not yet qualified for an interview, we don't make a yes/no decision at this point, because maybe that applicant's retaking the OAT in a month or two, or maybe we'll wait for fall grades to see if, depending on whatever the Achilles is, or whatever the aspect that might be denying or inviting for an interview yet. That's where it's important to have a discussion with Mr. Robertson or someone on the admissions team, so that you know, okay, what is it about my file that might be holding me back just a little bit? Maybe it's shadowing experience, maybe it's GPA, maybe it's OAT, or a modest combination of all three. So we would not send something out this early or make a judgment on your file right now, unless it were saying that you qualify for an interview. We would want to give you time to make any adjustment or improve your file. But also, as we mentioned in the presentation, listen to suggestions. If Mr. Robertson either proactively reaches out to you with a suggestion, or you contact him and say, well, Mr. Robertson, I submitted my application a month ago. I just want to kind of get a status, and what is it about my file that has yet pulled the trigger on an interview invite? And if he shares that with you, and it's an addressable feature like, well, we recommend more shadowing, or we'll wait on fall grades, or we recommend you're retaking the OAT, then certainly following through with that would be very important.
Josh says thank you, and he asks, if you're offered a seat after your interview, is that when you receive any scholarship or financial aid feedback, or would that be sent later?
Well, Josh, you're welcome for saying that. Yes, we try to make the scholarship, and then also if you're from a regional state or a contract state, We make those decisions simultaneous with admission. So what we don't want to do is send a student, congratulations, you're accepted. You're from a contract state like Arkansas or South Carolina or Kentucky or Tennessee or Georgia, et cetera. But we're not going to tell you whether they have a contract seat until later. No, we want to make those decisions very early on. For scholarship, the same thing applies. If accepted, and certainly if your credentials warrant, which the word scholarship would imply that your credentials are above average and strong, then yes, we usually make scholarship decisions within 24, 48 hours of admission. So our objective, especially this time of year and very early in the cycle, we think it behooves us, to be perfectly honest with you, that if someone comes in for an interview soon, is determined that we want to make an acceptance offer, and we also determine that the student qualifies for a major scholarship, the sooner we can pass that along to you and let you know, we think it helps you. Oh, Southern has let me know, and I know exactly where I stand. So it helps us to recruit the best and brightest and trying to be very expedient in the process. For those of you that might be applying in a future year, again, I cannot stress enough getting in your application early and your credentials early, because even though we offer more endowed scholarships than the other School of Optometry, it is a finite amount. And if we exhaust our scholarships by, let's say, October, November, and someone applies in December with incredible credentials, it's possible that we've already utilized all of our scholarships. Conversely, for those that are interviewing now and early, I don't like to look at it. Well, in theory, we might get a stronger applicant tomorrow in the mail or online if you meet all the criteria and you have presented yourself with an outstanding interview and you got a strong GPA OET. My thought is I want to reward that with not only early admissions decision, but also decision on scholarship or contract seat. So Josh, I hope that answered your question. And certainly if you had anything more specific, since scholarship can also be very pertinent to your individual aspects of like GPA, OET, I'm more than happy to talk to you further offline about that.
All right, so this question is, what are your tips on avoiding long pauses and awkward situations? And if they do arise, in what ways would they negatively affect the student?
Wow, what a great question. The interviewer is going to assume that you're nervous. So if it's sort of like nervous energy or nervous anxiety, don't let that bother you. In fact, it's a little endearing, to be perfectly honest with you, because when you're nervous on a situation like that, it shows how much you want this. So I'm not saying exacerbate it or make it too pronounced, but having a little nervous anxiety is perfectly expected and understandable. It's always okay if every now and then you apologize with your interview. Oh, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought, or I'm a little nervous. It's perfectly fine to be human in saying that from time to time. So what I would recommend is not scripting it, because you don't want to sound contrived, but in this setting, we probably have given you 80 or 90% of the questions. So be prepared in advance when asked, why do you want to be an optometrist? What was your undergraduate challenges like? What did you do? What kind of activities did you participate while you were in school, while you were studying? What was your biggest challenge? What are you looking for in a school of optometry? What was it about SEO that attracted you to apply? How do you want to practice optometry 10, 20 years from now? You notice these are not right or wrong questions, or questions with right or wrong or yes, no answers. But if you're prepared for a question of that ilk or something similar to that, when it does come up or a variation of it, I think it helps you with those awkward pauses or being a little more prepared. Again, don't script it, don't have some memorized, contrived reply. But if you're prepped for it, I think that will help you immensely. But if you do have that awkward pause or a little bit of nervous anxiety or energy, it's perfectly fine to tell the interviewer, and say, I'm sorry, I'm just a little nervous. They are expecting that.
Okay, so this question, well, first, Todd says that he's been in contact with Mr. Robertson for a while, but isn't sure if he's an OD or not. So I guess a good question is how to address someone if you don't know what their title is.
Yes.
And for the record, Todd, Mr. Robertson is not a doctor. And then he mentions that he was asked to strengthen his OAT scores by retaking the test. He takes it in 2 weeks. Should he email his scores after taking the test?
Okay, great.
And to whom?
Okay, first of all, it's never offensive for everyone in the admissions office, myself included. None of us are ODs. And it's been our practice that if we're ever addressed as an OD or a doctor, I usually say, thank you, but I did not yet earn that title, so just call me Mr. Hauser or something along those lines. But it's perfectly fine to address that. If you're really wanting to get it correct with us, and certainly most other optometrists I can imagine, if you go on our admissions webpage, our staff, we're listed. So you'll be able to see our pictures and our names and title and credentials. So unless you see doctor by the name, you could certainly refer to us as Mr. or Ms. and start that way. Regarding the OAT, by all means, send the scores, and in this case, directly to Mr. Robertson, because when you take the OAT, whether it be for the first time or a follow-up, remember, you get your scores immediately. You walk out of that testing center with the score. We may not get it for about 10 days. So what Mr. Robertson has done before, if everything about your file is ready to act upon, and he gets an OAT update, whether it be the first score or a follow-up score, and you score high enough that would warrant an interview. I've seen Mr. Robertson within 10, 15 minutes of receiving an email with your updated score invite you for an interview with something like, hey, John or Todd, thank you for sending me that update. This was the last piece of the puzzle that I needed, and congratulations on your fine score. I'm sending you, as soon as I'm done here, I'm sending you a formal invitation for an admissions interview. So Mr. Robertson, regarding that, is always good. Now, if you've been in communication with Rebecca or myself or Sonny Ewing over time, and we've gotten to know you better and know maybe your background and file a little bit, that's perfectly appropriate to contact us because we're a little more familiar with who you are in your background. But like if Rebecca or I were to get an OAT score, and we're happy to review and correspond with you, one of the first things we're going to do, especially if you're an active applicant, is to include Mr. Robertson in that to make sure he's aware of the score too.
We have a few questions about the application cycle, more generally speaking, and we're very happy to answer those questions now, but I will also offer a shameless plug here that we have a recorded webinar that you'll find on our YouTube page that I did a month or so ago about the application cycle. So I talked in detail about that whole timeline and all the details you would want to know, hopefully all the details you would want to know about the application process and timeline. So check out our YouTube page if you want more information about that. But these questions, the first, when does the application open? Around what month can I expect the application process to begin, and how long does it remain open? And then the other student asks if there are students who've already been interviewing for the 2020 admission cycle.
Great. The July 1st is typically the opening day of Optomcast. Now, I believe if July 1 falls on a weekend, they move it up to like June 29 or June 30 or June 28, something along those. But it's around July 1 when the Optomcast cycle opens, and our supplemental application opens at the same time. So that would be year in and year out, unless there's a major change or announcement in years to come, but I don't see that happening in the near future. And again, remember, not just getting your application in, but getting your supporting documentation, your OAT scores, your essays, your transcripts verified, validated, and all of that. If you apply and we don't have that information, there's really not much we can do with your file. So it's important to not only get your application in, but to follow up and get the supporting documentation, and or, as we've said a few times, if someone in the admissions office, in particular Mr. Robertson, sends a suggestion about, hey, everything looks great, but I recommend getting some more shadowing or experience or retaking the OET, that's kind of a wink, wink, nod, nod that we're going to need that before we can move. Regarding having interviews, yes, a few, not many. We really start in earnest in September after Labor Day, but I believe as of this Friday, we will have interviewed 25 for the month of August. So it's a a decent number, but we interview about 275 to 300 in a year. So the fact that even though we've entered 25, that's less than 10% of what we will have interviewed. But September, October are very busy months for interviews, because in September in particular, and maybe even the first week of October, we not only interview on Fridays, but we interview on most Mondays too, to try to capture as many of those applicants. So to answer your question, yes, we have just started. We have had some interviews, not many. So don't feel like if you haven't been invited or haven't applied yet, the iceberg has just, the tip has just been found. So we've just started, but yes, we have started the process. And again, if you're a future applicant, those who have interviewed, or we have one more early interview day on Friday, these are always the applicants that apply early, get their stuff in early, as well as having very strong credentials.
So I see a student asking about this particular webinar. It is being recorded, and I will post this to our YouTube page, within the next day or two. So you will be able to watch this recording after the fact. The next question is, what is the financial commitment to accept the admission offer?
Oh, what a great question. And this is, you'll get a large variance amongst the schools. And to be perfectly honest with you, it's kind of a bone of contingency for me, because let me just start off. A deposit, whether it's for SEO or any other school, I call it a dinner reservation. It's not a contractually binding. All it is please hold my seat. Now, there could be a modest financial impact that if you were to deposit and withdraw. For SEO, our initial deposit is $500, which is an advance payment on next year's tuition. For all schools, that's what a deposit is. And it'll be spelled out to you. Like this time of year, we give you 8 weeks to decide. In November, December, it goes down to 5 weeks. In January, February, it goes down to 3 weeks. And then after March 1, it's 2 weeks after acceptance. So it kind of tapers as we get further into the cycle. But if you deposit, it holds your seat. If you were to withdraw for any reason, it doesn't have to be a profound reason, we will refund $250 of the $500 as long as the withdrawal is made by April 30th. By April 30th, there is a second $500 deposit that is due, or a second deposit, again, which is an advance payment on your tuition. So from an ultimate standpoint, it's $1,000, but the second $500 deposit is not due until April 30th. And for the first deposit, that first $500, $250. I bring this up because the different schools have different policies. I wish we had a uniform deposit system and process, but I have not been able to convince my sister institutions of the wisdom of that. That was a little sarcasm. Because I do sympathize that I wish we could be a little more uniformed for you guys, because if you apply to 4 or 5 schools, then each school has a totally different deposit policy. It could be a little confusing. I will say this. I can authorize a 2-week extension on a deposit for any reason whatsoever. And I think most schools likewise would do the same. So that if you have a deposit policy coming up at school X and you have an interview at school Y a week later and you contact school X, is there any way I can get like a 2-week extension on that deposit timeline? I would be surprised if they didn't. In fact, I think it'd be a little short-sighted of the school if they didn't. But that is the financial commitment. Is most schools will have either a $500 or $1,000 initial deposit due within shortly after the acceptance decision, and there will be varying differences as far as if some of it's refundable or when, and the process with that.
Grace asks, will we know who is interviewing us before we arrive for the interview?
Not the interviewer. You'll know your tour guide. So you'll be told which student is giving your tour, where they're from, and they will have your contact information. So if lo and behold you're from Iowa State and your tour guide's also from Iowa State, if it's Cami, and it is, oh my gosh, my fellow Cyclone, y'all can connect and talk. Or if it's just simply wanting to talk in advance. We do not with the interviewer, because every now and then an interviewer may get called into a clinic assignment or making an adjustment. So if we told you in advance and we did that assignment, and then Dr. Wolf happens to be pulled out for a major research project and we have to do a substitute, we wouldn't want, oh, I was so looking forward to interviewing with Dr. Wolf. And that doesn't happen often, but it happens enough where we don't want to announce that, and then you go online and look up all the wonderful things. Dr. Wolf is one of my favorite faculty interviewers and faculty members in general, just using him as an example, that I wouldn't want for you in turn to, oh, let me look up everything there is to know about Dr. Wolf and get to know him. And then you get on campus and through circumstances beyond anyone's control, it's somebody else. So we do not announce the interviewer before time, but we do let you know your tour guide.
Aside from GPA, what are other criteria taken into account for a higher chance at scholarships? Mm-hmm. And related to GPA, do you take into account the rigor of the school or purely the number?
Yes and yes. The OAT is also very key because, and I'll use the age-old example, well, I only have a 3.5, but it was from Harvard. So therefore, the impression that it's a more challenging school, and very well could be. Well, usually, then in turn, you should be very well prepared for the OAT. So yes, we do look at the rigor, not just the rigor of the school, but time management in general. Are you taking 17, 18 hours or 12 hours? Are you working 25 hours a week or not? Are you involved in campus organizations and service leadership and things that, again, take from your time? Or not. So yes, the GP. Now, if you have a 2.5 GPA, even if you've worked 60 hours a week and you're president of SGA and you're on the varsity football team and everything, ultimately there still is an expectation of performance. So a lower GPA could preclude you from scholarship consideration. But from a scholarship standpoint, I would say GPA and OAT are weighted equally, because if you make the argument, well, I have a 3.6 versus a 3.7, but maybe I'm doing better in my sciences, or I think I went to a tougher school than somebody who made a 3.7. Well, that usually surfaces and is adequately addressed on the OAT. So if you have a 380 on the OAT and that 3.7 student has a 330 on the OAT, then that kind of makes your case a little more valid.
All right, we're getting around to an hour here, but we have a few more questions, and we'll keep going. Mr. Hauser gives the thumbs up, so we'll keep going. So a couple questions about the OAT. How many years can an OAT score be good for, and what if I retake the OAT and it's below a 300? Excellent question.
The OAT is good for 2 admission cycles. So if by the time you enter SCO, if it's more than 2 years, it would be considered dated. Now, another factor to take into consideration with the OAT, we take your best score, not necessarily your most recent. And that's another variance amongst the schools. So you want to make sure that you're aware. Some schools will only take the best score. No schools will average, because you can't really average the OAT because each section is different. But like, for example, let's say you make a 310 on the OAT, and well, that's good. It's maybe not great, and I might want to retake, but boy, I don't want to lose my 310. Let's say you made a 310, you went down to a 300. We would still consider the 310 your official score. And if I can just add, this is Joe Hauser opinion talking, I would give you kudos for trying it a second time and giving the effort of trying to improve your file, even if you weren't successful in improving it. I always like when a student acknowledges, hey, I may have done okay, but I can do better, and I want to try that. And even if they don't succeed, I always like to commend the effort and the recognition that, you know, my OAT is pretty good, but I'm gonna see if I can do better, whether it's to make myself more competitive for admission or a contract seat or a scholarship. I do always commend that activity.
So this question is about OptomCast. Can I submit OptomCast before my pre-health advisor submits the letter to OptomCast?
Yes, and especially this time of year or before the fall term and some of the faculty on your campus gets back to campus, we get weekly updates. So if you submitted your OptomCast, early July, right when it opens, but you're not able to communicate or contact your advisor or your biology teacher or whoever is going to be writing your academic letter of recommendation, ultimately, of course, we will need that. But even if that letter comes in September, that's not going to hold up your process, because we do get weekly updates. So if your advisor or science teacher submits that on September 5th, when they get back to campus in the fall, and we get those updates, that's still better than I would recommend that approach versus, well, I guess I have to wait until that letter gets in before I submit my OptomCast application. That would create a bottleneck. So get your OptomCast application in, and letters of recommendation, particularly the advisor letter, can be updated and are updated weekly. And chances are, shortly after you submit your application, we will have that, and that'll be one less thing that we could check off the list.
A question for international students: are there any fixed seats, or does it depend on the applicant pool? And I guess we could broaden that set and say geography in general.
Great question. Whether you're from Canada, whether you're from France, whether you're from Egypt, it does not matter. Whether you're from 3,000 miles away or 3 miles from campus, geography means zip as far as the attractiveness and the ability to get in. The only time where geography plays a role is with our contract states for funding. If you're from South Carolina will provide a subsidy for a certain number of students, as do other contract states. But that doesn't mean we're going to take X number of students from South Carolina. So geography means is not a direct factor. What I am very proud of, for 9 years in a row, and most likely 10 when this formal cycle is confirmed, for 9 years in a row, SCO, and we're the 3rd largest optometry school. So there are 2 others with more students, but for 9 consecutive years, we've had more states represented. And for example, the class that entered last year in 2019, we had 36 states. The 2nd largest was Illinois College of Optometry with 27. That's a pretty significant statistical difference, and that was a larger class than ours. And I find that very heartening, because that means we're attracting students from all over the country and internationally because of the quality of our program, the fact that we have the best board scores in the country, the fact that we have one of the biggest and busiest and most expansive clinics for patient care in the country, and great facilities. So I think SCO's reputation and product has gotten out, and we're attracting students from all over, including international. So geography, when I say it means nothing, it does mean something. It means to you and to us. What I'm saying is it's not a direct factor in saying, oh, I'm sorry, we have to take 35 from Memphis, or we have to take 50 from Tennessee. We do not have a quota. So we can take as many from foreign countries or from other states as we deem fit.
I really like this next question. So I'm not the best at talking up or bragging by any means. So when asked to tell them about yourself, what would be the best way you think to answer that?
Oh, that is a phenomenal question. Talk from the heart. Think about a few things that are important to you, even if it's not up talking, but simply, if you're a little concerned about bragging or coming across, a little, that way, think about why you've chosen optometry and what is that passion about giving back or providing quality care. And when you can talk from the heart, that's telling about you without necessarily saying, well, I was Beta Sigma Kappa, I was RA of my dorm, I was captain of the football team or of the debate team or whatever those accolades might be. So if that's not your disposition or that's not your natural tendency, then I would recommend being prepared to talk about the things about optometry and going to optometry school that are important to you, because I still think that can convey to your interviewer, your background and passion. And again, we'll be able to tell, how sincere and how convinced and devoted you are with that passion. Even if you're soft-spoken, it's not whether you're an introvert or an extrovert. That has nothing to do with it. Trust me. Believe it or not, I'm an introvert. But when you're talking about something that you're excited about and committed about and have strong feelings about, it just naturally takes over. And the interviewers are great. They'll be able to tell pretty early whether you're nervous, maybe whether you're an introvert naturally or an extrovert, and kind of guide you through it to a little bit. And as long as you're able to talk one-on-one, because guess what? That's what it's going to be like with a patient. When you're in the office in the exam room with Mrs. Jones, Mrs. Jones doesn't know what's wrong with her. That's why she's entrusting her eyes and vision and care to you. So it's not just diagnosing, but explaining to Mrs. Jones, here's why you're having visual problems, and here's what we're going to do about it. And that's where the communication comes in. So that's a great question. If you're not inclined to talk a lot about yourself, then just talk about things that you're passionate about, and that will come through.
I'm going to combine a couple questions specifically about the interview. So one student asks how frequently we review applications to consider for an admissions interview. Mm-hmm. And then another asks how many applicants are typically present on an interview day.
The review is continuous. Mr. Robertson and all of us, we all have the information at our disposal. So if I or Rebecca see the reports and we may, I met this applicant a month ago, either on a campus visit or when I was recruiting, I've noticed he or she hasn't been invited for an interview. We'll go to Mr. Robertson sometime. Well, Mike, hey, I'm just curious what's up with this one particular applicant. So it's a continuous review. And again, Mr. Robertson, now he typically communicates by email. So if email is not your favorite mode of communication, just be aware that that's how he's typically interviewing, or I should say is communicating with you. So keep an eye out on making sure that you're checking his emails, and he will keep you posted. But it is a continuous review. It's not, we only review files twice a year or something along those lines. For the interview day question, typically there are a few exceptions, like the interview that we have this coming Friday is only 9. But a typical interview day on a Friday or Monday is a maximum of 12, 6 in the morning, 6 in the afternoon. So the cohort or the group that you're with would have up to 5 others on the interview time. But what we do have in the middle, we have an applicant lunch with financial aid and housing where all 12 or up to all 12 are present together. And that's the one time where everybody is in the same room for the interview. It's the last thing for the morning group. It's the first thing for the afternoon group. But on an interview day, there's 12 total, up to 12 total. But in your group, at the time that you're interviewing, there should be no more than 5 other applicants interviewing at the same time.
It looks like this might be the last question. Do you take into consideration the GPA number in comparison to the degree for admissions and acceptance, generally speaking? So would you look at chemistry degree versus an English degree as an example? Very,
very good question. And it's a yes/no answer. We look at your prerequisite GPA. So let's say you're an English major. And I was an English minor, so I feel like I can say this and be a little self-deprecating. Do I think is English as rigorous as chemistry or biology or microbiology? No. I still think it's a good major. But if a student had a 3.5 overall GPA and you might say, oh, well, a 3.5 English major isn't as strong as a 3.5 chemistry major, as an example. And there might be some, some argument to that. But if that 3.5 English major had a 3.6 in the sciences, well, that's telling. If that English major was taking 18 hours a term because he or she was getting all their English degree requirements and their optometry degree prerequisites simultaneous, and in 4 years had to take 18 hours to accomplish that, versus maybe the other student was taking 14, 15 hours, we take that into consideration. It's all taken into consideration. So the thing I understand most about the question, that all else being equal, if a student's taking 16, 17 hours at a grade school majoring in chemistry or biology or biochemistry, compared to a student at the same school with the same hours, maybe taking an English or humanities, is at a different level of difficulty, I think most would say yes. But that doesn't mean that the liberal arts or the English or the humanities major is less accomplished, especially if they have excelled in the prerequisites. So that's how we typically look at it.
All right, I think that's bringing us to the end here. You guys, those are great questions. So thank you all, and thank you all for being here. And kudos to you for actually taking a positive, productive step to being a successful interviewee. So once again, thank you. We hope you'll tune in to some of the webinars we have in the fall. And again, if you have any suggestions or topics you'd like to hear, feel free to shoot me an email. But we hope you all enjoy the rest of your summer, and perhaps we'll see some of you here soon enough for your own interview. So thanks again.
Thank you, guys.